All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the final session in our Protestant Reformation summer series. My name is Danielle Kuhn. Quick and final disclaimer, I am not an expert. I don't have a PhD in this subject. I'm just a girl who loves learning about church history and loves it when there's a little bit of theology mixed in as well. So, with that said, let's get into it. So last session we talked about the final actions of the Council of Trent and the liturgical reforms that occurred to both the Mass, the breviary, liturgy in general, the Roman Missal, and the reforms that took place to reform priests, seminaries coming about and that kind of thing. Today we're talking about specifically the Jesuits and the Society of Jesus. There are a lot of orders that came about from the Reformation, like a lot. There were the Lazarists, the Eutychs, the Ursulines, the Sulpicians, the Piarists, the Oratory of St. Philip Neri, the Hospitallers, and the Oratory of Jesus and Mary, which I don't have a picture of. And then in addition, there were new reformed chapters of the Dominicans, the Benedictines, the Carmelites, and the Franciscans. So, all that to say, the Jesuits were by no means the only new religious orders that came in response to the Protestant Reformation. Because of the attitude of renewal that was occurring during this time, a lot of religious orders were created. There was a lot of zeal and kind of desire to help renew the faith going on among the people. So, the Jesuits, however, were particularly influential and important during this time period of the Catholic response to the Reformation. All of these orders arose to a kind of multiplicity of spiritualities that existed during this time. And it was a beautiful thing that so many different religious orders came about to cater to and be available for all of those different spiritualities. But the monastic calling, though very good, was one that wasn't quite as fitted to the needs of this time period, to answering to the needs of this time period, as a non-monastic religious order such as the Jesuits. So the Society of Jesus, commonly known as the Jesuits, holds a special place within the Reformation narrative because it was one of the most extraordinary and innovative and influential of these new orders. The Jesuits have a bit of a history that's oftentimes distorted by a little bit of myth and caricature. They were called the Pope's Army and often characterized as zealots, reduced to being thought of these kind of militant soldiers of the church in Rome. And that's it comes because they take a special vow of obedience to the Pope, but that characterization of them as the Pope's army or these militant soldiers is really pretty off base. The Jesuits have a kind of paradoxical way of doing things. They are simultaneously often people who break from tradition and push boundaries and are exploring new areas, while at the same time being really faithful to tradition and the church and their founding principles. And there is a tension that exists in the Jesuits from that paradoxical focus. But let's talk about how they started, because they start with this guy, Inigo Lopez de Loyola. I just laugh at how awful my accent must be, but I don't want to try because I'm sure it would be even worse, so I'm just going to totally butcher it and apologize for it. Inigo Lopez de Loyola. Better known, of course, as Saint Ignatius of Loyola, or at the time, initially just Ignatius of Loyola. Ignatius was born to a very noble family, and he grew up as a courtier and a knight, not unlike a previous saint that we've talked about, Saint Francis. Grew up with this life of, obviously not a king or anything like that, but a luxurious life. He did not want for anything. And he dreams of being a knight, and was really into that sort of literature about knights, and kind of, we would call them fairy tales. They would call them tales of chivalry and great deeds. Ignatius was very into that and wanted to make that his life. He wanted the glory and the fame and the amazing battles where he's the hero, and the stories that would later be told about him and all of his accomplishments. That was his vision for his life. And similar to Francis again, his life was not exactly pious at this time. There was a lot of carousing, fighting, gambling, drinking, and not a lot of thoughts towards God. God was not really on Ignatius's radar. He enters a war against Charles V. Remember, Charles V, he comes up all the time, but he's the Holy Roman Emperor. He's in everyone's business. And when he enters this war, like I said, religion is the last thing on his mind. During a battle, though, he gets hit by a cannonball. Specifically, his legs get smashed by a cannonball, which, so painful. And while he's healing, he's really feeling bitter about his fate. Again, because he dreamed of being a knight. Having glory in battle was his big plan for life. So to have his leg smashed by a cannonball, medicine was not like it is now, of course. So his chances for being able to completely heal and go back out and fight in wars were very, very slim. And he had a really long recuperation period to fix his legs, which had been literally smashed. It was not a clean break. It was a cannonball type break. So focused was Ignatius on wanting to get back out there onto the battlefield and succeeding in attaining this dream of being a noble knight that upon seeing that his shattered right leg definitely was going to heal in such a way that he wouldn't be able to run really or fight in battle, he had the bone rebroken, trimmed with a saw, and reset, all without anesthesia. Can you imagine just having your poor, wounded, barely healing leg broken again, trimmed with a saw, all without anesthesia? It gives you kind of a look into the type of determination and fiery passion that Ignatius had. But this whole surgery that he had really just led to more disappointment, because it became very clear one leg was now shorter than the other leg, and it became clear that he was going to walk with a limp for the rest of his life, and he did. As he was healing from his second surgery, however, he had only 2 books available for him to read. He's just laying around all day. There's nowhere for him to go as he waits for these legs to heal, and he's only got 2 books to read. The first is The Life of Christ, and the second is The Golden Legend. Both of these books were medieval devotional texts. So The Life of Christ was a manual for meditation and prayer, and then The Golden Legend was a collection of saints' lives. So on the one hand, he has a book all about meditations on Christ, and on the other hand are stories of the lives of the saints. Gradually, a transformation, while Ignatius is recovering, ignited and instigated by these books, begins to take place in Ignatius. Previously, all of his heroes are these knights that he's read about that have these glorious achievements and brave accomplishments, and that's what he wanted. Now, knowing that he would never be able to do that, he's reading all these stories of saints. And he's drawing some parallels. Saints have great achievements, amazing accomplishments. They do incredible things. But their purpose isn't about glory, or at least it's not about their own glory, but the glory of God. And he gets to know God better through this Life of Christ book that he's meditating and praying with every day. So instead of longing to imitate valiant knights, Ignatius gains a new set of role models to look up to, namely the saints and Christ himself. And he has a pretty intense conversion during this time, after which he doesn't want to do anything half-heartedly. He wants to go full throttle into his new passion of loving and pursuing Christ. So as soon as he can walk again, Ignatius begins a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Before he goes, he makes a special pledge of loyalty and does this special vigil of adoration, making a pledge of loyalty to the Blessed Virgin Mary, which I think is interesting because it kind of reflects Don Quixote's pledge of loyalty to his lady Dulcinea in Don Quixote's story. Of course, very different. Blessed Virgin Mary, Lady Dulcinea, there's a decidedly obvious difference, degree of holiness between those two people. But it's almost like he's still finding a way to fulfill that desire to be a valiant knight. He's going to have, instead of just a Lady Dulcinea, though, he's going to have the Blessed Virgin Mary be his patroness. So that's what he does before leaving. And then eventually, Ignatius turns his method of discerning God's will into a book that's very famous now, which is called The Spiritual Exercises. It is a pretty technical manual for spiritual directors and retreats. It's not really like a devotional. It's more akin to kind of like a manual for directors, spiritual directors or retreats. Yeah, I think that's the best way to describe it. It's like a manual. Yeah. It was a text that really flew in the face of Protestantism at the time because, it's literally called The Spiritual Exercises. Exercises are something that you do. It is a book that you read and you follow the manual to do exercises for your soul. That is something that just at face value is very anti-Protestant, because the movement of Protestantism is to get away from doing things with your soul. You don't need to do anything with your soul because the justification of Christ covers you in such a way that you do nothing. It's kind of plopped on top of you. So, Spiritual Exercises of Ignatius, very anti-Protestant, although it might not seem obvious at first glance. A big part of the spiritual exercises, which I think is really, really valuable, is having a focus on awareness of your own thoughts and feelings that are tied to thoughts. And when you did this action, how were you feeling? What were you thinking about that led to that action? And that's a very good and natural thing to have, because our thoughts influence our will influences our actions, and our actions influence our habits. So a lot of times when we're trying to change a habit, the first place we start at is saying, oh, I need to change my actions. As long as I change my actions, that'll change my habits. But really, it starts quite a bit before actions. It starts at thoughts. We change our thoughts. That helps to change our will, which helps to change our actions and habits. And the spiritual exercises recognize this and strive to make people a lot more aware of their thoughts. You can't always control your thoughts, It's not asking you to police your thoughts or always have perfect thoughts, but it pushes for awareness of thoughts, such that if you have a thought where you recognize that this is not of God, or this is a lie from the evil one, you can recognize that, let that thought go. That's the kind of thing it encourages, just really awareness of what's going on in your own mental landscape. Plus much else. Yeah. The exercises also really stress the principle of finding God within the world that we're in now, in the material world, and working within the world to magnify God's glory through selfless and humble service to others. So the Jesuits saw the world as this beautiful place to redeem, not a hellscape to run from. And this is also pretty anti-Protestant for the time, because there was, and it doesn't exist as obviously in Protestantism today, although it's hard to say that definitively because there's so many variations of Protestantism now. But during the time period of Ignatius, it was very decidedly anti-Protestant because the Protestants had that push away from the material world. This is a terrible, fallen, depraved world that we all just have to suffer through until we get to heaven. It's that idea of transcendence that people like Zwingli really wanted to have. Oh, the spiritual God, the spiritual realm cannot come in close contact with the material realm because that is just so like gross. Impossible to have the two intermingled. Whereas Jesuits are saying, no, this is a beautiful world that's got a lot of problems, but we can redeem it. Like we can, God's grace and love is at work in the world, working to redeem this world. And that's beautiful. And that's what we can recognize in the world. Because anything that is created is good. It might be different degrees of good, but if it exists, it's good. And it's kind of a whole different thing to talk about. But yes, they stressed leading a virtuous life so that you could magnify God's glory on earth. Being the closest to who God created you to be as you can glorifies God by being the creation he made you to be. And that's a big thing that the Jesuits stressed. If we live virtuously, we live as we were created to be, and that glorifies God. It's that sort of simple. I know it's a lot more complicated than that. Like, oh, just live a virtuous life. But yeah, they had a motto, which was ad Meorum Deum Gloriam. Oh, I think I might be getting the Latin suffixes mixed up. But if you ever see a cross with the letters AMDG around it, this is kind of a fancy version of their symbol or motto. A lot of times you'll just see a really simple cross, and in the 4 quadrants it says AMDG. That's the Jesuit motto, which stands for the greater glory of God. Ad Meorum Deum Gloriam. That was their mission. So back to Ignatius. A bowl fell. We're okay. Okay, back to Ignatius. He is like in his fully evolved saintlier state now. He's come out of recuperation and his pilgrimage and his spiritual exercises, and now he is resplendent in all his more saintly colors. He goes and studies at the University of Paris, where he gathers a few followers around him, and with 6 men who become the original Jesuits, he goes to Rome and asks to start the Society of Jesus. It was finally approved by the Pope on September 27th, 1540, after all the men had been ordained priests. So this was a while in the works. What is that phrase I'm looking for? Getting the Society of Jesus off the ground was not something that happened overnight for Ignatius of Loyola. I don't know if I mentioned when the date he was born. Or did I mention that it was 1521 when Ignatius was 30 years old when he got hit by the cannonball? So when it's approved later in 1540, that has been a whole 19 years later. He's done a lot of learning, a lot of growing, and a lot of writing before the Society of Jesus finally gets approved. And at this time, he's already 49. So the Society of Jesus begins to expand rapidly. And part of this is its really innovative character. And this is where we get into why the Jesuits were really influential for their time period post-Reformation. So they were a little bit different in terms of religious order. They had no set garb, like there was no set uniform for the Jesuits, no fixed prayer times, no communal prayer, no central monastery. They refused requests to say Mass for the dead. They also agreed to never become a bishop or a cardinal unless expressly asked by the Pope. So if the Pope expressly asked them, then they say yes, because they have this vow of obedience to the Pope. And Ignatius also insisted on no extreme fasts or self-mortification. So on the surface, you might think, oh yeah, no wonder so many people were attracted to the Jesuits. They're like the easy religious order. No uniforms, no rules, we don't have to eat the same boring food, we don't have to accept people's special requests for the dead, we don't have to have fixed prayer times, we don't have to have extreme fasts. This is awesome, this is the life, this is the easy religious order. But this is not the reason that they had all of these innovative rules in place. It was not so that they could be the easy order. Rather, it was to allow them to have increased mobility, increased flexibility, and they wanted those things, Ignatius wanted those things so they could better be at the beck and call of other people. So it wasn't it wasn't because he hated fasts that he didn't want fasts, but he wanted his Jesuits to always be ready to answer the call at any time if they were needed. So they couldn't be having extreme fasts, because what if the Pope needed them in the middle of an extreme fast? Were they going to say, hold up, Pope, let me finish my extreme bread and water fast that I'm doing for 30 days, and then I'll help you out? Or maybe they try to help out, but they're so weak from their bread and water fast that they aren't able to do a good enough job. The purpose of the Jesuits was to be this kind of feet on the ground, anything you need, Pope, we are your guys type of order. Like, we're willing to go anywhere, do anything, let us know your requests and your needs and we'll do it. And because that was at the heart of their mission, they couldn't have things like set prayer times, because what if part of their mission required them to be doing something when there was a special call to prayer? They couldn't have certain uniforms, because what if they were asked to go be missionaries at a place where it was dangerous to wear a certain uniform that showed that you were a priest, or where in order to better be a missionary to the people, you needed to wear something that was local. Because of the nature of their job, they needed to have more flexibility. But it wasn't for their own selfish benefit. It was so that they could give more of themselves more easily to whoever asked. Jesuits were meant to be contemplatives in action. So even while they're doing all these things, they're supposed to be doing these things with prayer, which is a big part of the spiritual exercises, like taking prayer with you in everything you do, examining the things that you do and being like, how does this take me towards God, or how does this take me away from God? Meant to be constantly engaged in a pastoral mission with the world. It wasn't something that you just prayed at meal times. You pray all the time with the actions that you're doing wherever you are. This flexibility really allowed them to spread out across the world. They didn't initially intend to become like the missionaries, but because of how flexible their order was, they ended up becoming the missionaries, and they spread throughout the world. This spreading actually served to increase their community. You would think it'd be the opposite, because they're going all over the globe, that they would have lesser amounts of community. But because they're all over the place, they have to constantly correspond with one another. They're writing letters every day, all the time, to make sure that they're still in line with what they've been requested to do, and to make sure that they are safe in what they're doing. So there was a strong community among the Jesuits because they wrote so frequently to one another. It wasn't like if you were at a monastery in Italy and you hadn't left for 40 years and you only know like the 10 other brothers that are in your monastery. The Jesuits had a really intense social network at the time. Jesuits were also, and I've mentioned this a little bit, but they were also characterized by their vow to accept any mission deemed necessary by the Pope, which strengthened their sense of purpose, as well as strengthened the papacy at this time. It helps the papacy out when you've got a group of guys who are like, we're your men. Anything you need, call us, we're there. But this vow is also what led to them being characterized as the Pope's Zealots. I mean, I feel like it's a little unfair to just characterize someone who takes a vow of obedience, specifically when it's done kind of for the sake of Christ and holiness, to characterize them as zealots, because in a way, wouldn't we all be zealots then? Don't we all have vows of obedience to Christ that we constantly mess up on? I guess the world at large currently, our secular society, would probably agree that the vast majority of Catholics, like real, living out their faith daily and weekly Catholics, are zealots. So, I don't know, maybe it's fair. So, teaching. The other thing that the Jesuits are really, really associated with are education, Jesuit schools. Loyola, that name is attached to a lot of different universities. And just like being missionaries, the Jesuits kind of stumbled onto this role of educators. So they were asked to open a school for children in Italy in 1548. And it was after this that the Jesuits kind of adopted education into their mission because it went so well. After establishing this first school and staffing it with Jesuits, requests for more schools began to pour in. So this first school was 1548, and by the 1560s, the Jesuits were running about 150 colleges. Then later, by 1615, so I know this is jumping a bit, but by 1615, the number had grown to 370, with schools in Latin America, India, and Japan, as well as the more, all over Europe and Italy. The establishment of schools created by the Jesuits created a wonderful situation where it generated both demand and supply. It generates demand because you have all these schools, which were free, that you could come to and receive a good quality education. This is after the reforms have been made, making sure that priests get adequate formation in a seminary. So priests are a lot more educated, and Jesuits especially were a lot more educated. So when you had these schools staffed by Jesuits giving free quality education, it just asked for more schools. It was like great publicity. People would leave these schools and be like, check out the Jesuits. I got a free education there. You can get a free education there. Oh, they're full? Well, maybe ask for another school. But then it also created increased supply. because they were churning out these people who had gone to their schools, been very impressed with the Jesuits, and said, yeah, I want to join the Jesuits. They seem like pretty great guys. They don't have to wear a uniform. They don't have to fast ever. I don't know if that was really on their minds. But yeah, getting the opportunity to educate all these young people really generated a lot of support for the Jesuits. So these schools were really beneficial for them. By 1615, only 75 years after the order had been founded, and this is a time where communication is not great. It is not fast. And it was only founded with 6 different men. There were 13,000 Jesuits. Yeah. Pardon me a second. I need to ask my husband to check on our baby. All right. Okay, thank you. Thank you for being patient. So, 13,000 in 75 years, which is kind of a crazy amount of people in that short of a time for that time period. Due to this mission of education, the Jesuits eventually had experts in every field within their order, from astronomy to botany to literature and ancient languages. Because their purpose, like education, became a greater and greater part of their purpose and mission, they were like, we need to make sure not only do we have quality priests teaching, but we should just have priests who are able to teach well all these other subjects in addition. So they recruited people to study all these different varieties of sciences so that they could be taught in their schools. I believe Pope Francis, who is a Jesuit, has a master's in chemistry. So the tradition still continues through to today. Jesuits, it might be required, I'm not positive, but they very, very often, at least, have either a master's or a bachelor's in something that's not theology or philosophy, like some kind of science or English maybe. So Jesuit schools really contributed greatly to combating Protestantism by educating Catholics on theology. Catechesis for Catholics is a perennial problem. Catholicism is a very deep, complex, and gorgeously beautiful and intricate religion and theology and philosophy. The focus of Catholicism is reality and truth itself, which is not one note. It is multidimensional and absolutely immense. Because of this, catechesis is an important part of it. Because there's such depth to it, to really encounter the beauty of Catholicism, you have to make an effort to learn about it. You can do surface level Catholicism, like just go to Mass every Sunday. Sometimes I go to confession. This is just something my family does, whatever. But if you do that, you're not really encountering the full, authentic Catholic faith. Because to really encounter that faith is to learn more about it and know it in a deeper manner. That's not just surface level. It's maybe a cheesy metaphor, but it truly is like just going to Mass every Sunday and then not truly knowing about your faith is like playing in a tide pool your whole life when there is an ocean out there. Like Catholicism is an ocean. And so we have this problem of how do we teach catechesis to people when we have such a deeply beautiful and complex faith that is all about the nature of reality itself. That's a big task to pass on. generation after generation that understanding of something so beautiful successfully. So during the time of the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic response, just as we have this same problem now, there was the problem of this catechesis. How do we teach people? How do we reach those people who maybe can't read or struggle to understand things sometimes? Like, how do we give them the fullness of faith? We need to find ways to get out to everyone. This is something the Catholic Church is always struggling with. And the Jesuits were one way to help solve this problem. They provided free schooling. And not only did this help educate Catholics who could then defend their faith, and because they understood it, a lot better to Protestants, but this educated Protestants, because since the school was offered for free and it was a quality education, a lot of Protestants ended up sending their kids there, and they learned about Catholic theology, and oftentimes they would come out Catholic. So this had a really positive effect in responding to the Protestant Reformation through this education about the faith. I don't know if there's a specific person that says it. I feel like it's G.K. Chesterton or Fulton Sheen, but nobody actually hates the Catholic faith. Or maybe, nobody actually hates the Catholic faith. But there are millions of people who hate what they think the Catholic faith is. Again, we're always struggling with this difficult task of educating people on what the theology of Catholicism is and what the faith really is and what it really means. And the Jesuits in this way really helped. So, let's get into some specific Jesuit ministries. There was the Ministries of Souls. So they had a really strong reputation as confessors and preachers and spiritual directors, which is understandable because they're so focused on, all right, what are these thoughts that are influencing your will, which is influencing your actions? It wasn't just like, oh, you're doing a bad thing, like, stop doing that. Well, why do you keep sinning? Like, and I'm not saying priests say that, but it was more than just surface level, hey, let's not do this anymore. It was what have you been thinking about lately that you think is causing you to have a movement of your will towards this action? Like, where are your thoughts? Why do you think you're doing this? So because of that, they're really liked for being spiritual directors. Some Jesuits who were confessors to kings and queens. Actually, I'm not going to get into it. It's a whole thing. It would take too long to... I guess I'll just say that going back to that paradox of Jesuits pushing the envelope while also being very traditional and faithful, historically, because they live in this space of being innovative while also clinging to tradition, the being innovative side sometimes turns out Jesuits that really walk that line of heresy. Looking at you, James Martin and Richard Rohr. And for that reason, and a number of other things, they were popular confessors for kings and queens of the time period. Yeah. Ministry of charity. So they're also very zealously ministered to the sick, needy, poor, and homeless. All new recruits were required to engage in such service as part of their training. So doing some intense ministry was part of the training it took to become a Jesuit. They also helped create and expand lay confraternities. So we talked a tiny, tiny, minuscule bit about confraternities last session. They're basically like, think of Knights of Columbus or Altar Rosary Society. It's that type of thing. And the Jesuits helped expand these lay groups of ministry that were also dedicated to helping charitable institutions. These lay confraternities too really became outreaches of Jesuit spirituality and helped to make it more popular and well known, which in turn increased the Jesuit influence. They also had a ministry of print. They're so involved in education that, they got really big into writing and publishing at an impressive rate. They published a lot of devotional manuals, and they actually were the ones who published the Summae Doctrinae Christianae, that catechism written specifically for youth at the time. See, innovative. They thought of writing a youth catechism way back in 1565. 1555. They also had a ministry of politics. So they wrote a lot of texts discussing the rights and the duties of Catholics living under Protestant rulers, just as Protestants earlier had written many texts about your duties and obligations and what you had that were rights living under Catholic rulers. They specifically addressed the question regarding civil authority, like the rights of subjects threatened by religious violence and persecution, which played a key role in contentious countries like France and England, who at the time were just having a lot of upheaval due to disagreements in religion. Jesuits came to acquire a very negative reputation in English culture, so in England, because the Jesuits had constant efforts to subvert Protestantism there, and they had a lot of a tendency to use disguises while they were in England, which they could do because they didn't have any set uniform. So in England, they were like the annoying gadfly that just wouldn't stop pushing Catholicism on their largely Protestant-leaning subjects. Some of the Jesuit writings on politics were used by individuals, and this is not a great thing, but they were used by individuals to justify the killing of kings, as in the case of Henry the Fourth, who was stabbed to death by a Catholic zealot who had been inspired by Jesuit works. It happens. There will always be people who will misread things and use different texts as an excuse to do really heinous crimes. Those people will always be out there. So the Jesuits enjoyed immense popularity in an amazingly quick time period for the era. I mean, now if we think of an organization that grew that much in a period of 75 years, we'd be like, it took forever for them to get big. But for that time period, that was huge. Because one, there is no shortage of religious orders. There are a lot of other competitors attracting people who want to get involved in religious life. Two, no internet, no phones, no texting, no emails. Everything is done by very, very slow letters. So the fact that the Jesuits grew so fast in popularity and became so renowned in a matter of 75 years across the globe, that's a big deal. And that was a really big win for them. There was a little bit of a price to their success, though. And to an extent, this still dogs them today. So in 1612, a book began to circulate claiming to be the Jesuit secret master plan to dominate the world. So if you see those books around today about secret societies plotting to dominate the world and secret cults that are going to take over everything, those books have always existed. Back in 1612, they were already writing them about the Jesuits, and this book is still in print today. It was written by a kind of bitter Polish ex-Jesuit who had been expelled from the order in 1612, but he passed it off as having been written by a Jesuit superior general to give it more credibility. It, quote, revealed that Jesuits only really wanted power and wealth. And again, this book was published long into the past 100 years. It's still been going around. It's a clear measure, however, of the Jesuit success during this time, because no one writes a book like that about organizations that are not successful and that are failing. Clearly, the Jesuits were making waves, sometimes negative ones. Also, not every order liked the Jesuits. The Dominicans gave them stiff opposition. Historically, the Dominicans and the Jesuits academically tend to clash. So in practice, what does that look like? Not these disagreements that they have don't really have concrete ways of acting out. Like, it's not like they're disagreeing about, you really need to wear this certain white robe, and it's not like they're mad about something really super tangible like that. It's more they argue about the exact mechanisms of interplay between human free will and grace, and what does that look like. And it gets really high-minded and abstract really fast, and unless you're a theologian or a Jesuit scholar or a Dominican scholar, it's very difficult to understand their disagreements and battles. Franciscans also became rivals of the Jesuits in the missionary field, because there were a lot of Franciscan missionaries too, so sometimes they would butt heads a little bit. In the 18th century, the Jesuits would be kind of associated with Jansenism, fairly or unfairly, and they would become so controversial that they kind of were suppressed by the papacy for a little bit and almost ceased to exist. But then they came back strong and founded many, many colleges across the U.S. I feel like this map doesn't even have all of them, but there's a good many. Many people don't realize that these are all Catholic colleges, but they are. They are. I mean, at least they claim to be. There is a bit of a trend that many Jesuit universities, while still having nominally Catholic roots, tend to be not necessarily reflect that Catholic of a nature, which I can't necessarily fault them for. They cater to a largely secular student body. But I mean, if you go to Regis University, I have friends who went to Regis, took different ethics classes, and were the only ones in their ethics class who defended the pro-life position, or were the only ones that they knew on campus who defended the sanctity of marriage. So, and that's kind of a common trend that you can see at different Jesuit universities across the country. Not saying they're bad universities. I am saying if you choose, or your child chooses, to go to one of these Jesuit universities, do your research and be aware that there is a strong likelihood that you will go to a university with a Catholic history and a church on campus, but other than that, not really share that much Catholic culture. So that was a sidebar. They came back strong. Despite the controversy that the Jesuits engendered, they still sometimes really engender today. Again, James Martin, Richard Rohr, looking at you. They undeniably made a really significant contribution to shaping modern Catholicism by bringing and popularizing education so much, by being missionaries that took Catholicism to all these parts of the world. Hugely, hugely influential in the 1600s, 1700s. 1600s, weak time in the 1700s, but then they come back strong for the 1800s and 1900s. The next chapter after the Jesuits, not necessarily after the Jesuits, the next chapter for the Catholic Church after this Catholic response to the Protestant Reformation, deals with the church responding to new, different challenges, like empirical positivism and imperialism, which I know sounds similar, but those two things are very different. The fallout from ideological movements in the Enlightenment, having to navigate colonies, slavery, all of these things are issues that the church faced in the centuries following the 1400s, 1500s. And they are a different series. So this series ends here with the Jesuits. Kind of missionary life is beginning, and that's the start of the next chapter for the Catholic Church. But this is kind of a good closing part for a series just examining the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic response to the Protestant Reformation. Later, there are new heresies that are just kind of old heresies called something new that pop up. Pelagianism, which is the belief that we can earn our free will, or we can earn our salvation. That's always popping up in different forms, constantly, and still does today, whether we recognize that it's Pelagianism or not. Jansenism, which was more kind of erring on the Protestant idea of things, where you don't have free will and there's double predestination, came about in the 1700s. And the church is constantly having to navigate new things that the world throws at it, just as it is still doing today. I'm not saying that I'm glad the Reformation happened, because I don't think I can say that. But I don't know that I can say that with 100% honesty that I wish the Reformation had never happened either. Because the Protestant Reformation caused the Catholic Counter-Reformation, which improved, strengthened, purified, and reinvigorated the church. And it was really pretty desperately needed at this time, after centuries of creeping corruption and abuse and vice. When I think about that, the fact that the Protestant Reformation was kind of this unfortunate evil that then caused a strengthening of the church and a purification of its body, I think about how God constantly is doing that in the Bible. God's people are always having to undergo this painful purification process because they have this evil that's crept in due to sin. That's always happening, right? The people are always erring, committing sin, and then having to undergo the painful consequences of that sin. But those consequences strengthen the people. Another theme you're always seeing in the Bible is that sin causes division and disunity. From the very beginning, Adam and Eve, Seth and Ham, Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau, Joseph and his brothers, Moses and the people, the Hebrews wandering throughout the desert, the kingdom of Israel. You see this all the time where a sin is committed and the consequences of that sin are this division and disunity. And God has to kind of call his people back and call his people back and call his people back. So the Protestant Reformation results in this painful purifying process that caused division. And it was necessitated really by the sins of the church. I don't know if I'd say necessitated. That's too strong. But it was caused by the sins of the church's members, the members of the church. And that ultimately led to righting the path for the church. I think we sometimes conceive of salvation history as having ended when the Bible ended. Like, God went through this whole process of salvation history throughout the Old Testament, and then Jesus died on the cross, and then like some followers did some things, created the church, and now we're kind of just living in post-salvation history. But we live in the continuation of salvation history. We still are existing here and now in a time where God is constantly trying to draw us to himself, constantly trying to redeem his people, to gather his people unto himself. So yes, Christ's crucifixion was the climax and the focal point of salvation history, but it extends outward from the crucifixion in both directions. And in the time prior to Christ's crucifixion, we see God constantly trying to gather his people to himself and bring them back. And in the time after the crucifixion, I think we still see God trying to gather his people to himself and bring them back. And we see the consequences of sin, which is constantly division and disunity. So that's kind of my 2 cents on the Protestant Reformation. It has been a lot of fun doing this series as we continue through this pandemic the best we can, which I think again is just another thing God is going to use to call us to himself and have a purifying process for his church. We might have more of these. We might do another series. I would love to do one on philosophy of religion, like philosophical notions that are at the bedrock of Catholic theology. Not only looking at ideas that the Catholicism agrees with, but ones that we don't agree with. I don't know how much interest there would be in that. But yeah, those are kind of things that we're thinking about at St. John's. Just trying to find ways to connect with people and make you guys know that you're not alone and your church is here for you. And if you need anything, you can reach out to any of its members. I hope you guys have a great Tuesday night. Thank you so much for joining me on this trip. And I hope to see you guys around the church. Bye.